Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Stan Miller. Joining me today is tax and business attorney Jeffrey Katz. Jeffrey, thank you for the time today. Welcome.
Thank you, Stan. It's a pleasure to be here with you on your show today.
So I want to get a little background. You know, I've read your resume and you've done some pretty impressive things. But tell me what was it that initially motivated you to get into this space, the estate planning, business planning space?
Sure. Hey, Stan, that's a great question. When I got out of law school, I went to work for a big six accounting firm at KPMG. It's kind of my first gig out of school. And so within that first year, I was working on major M&A activities, working with C-level execs, really kind of getting my hands dirty and sleeves rolled up on some of what were then the most interesting and innovative tax products that were being sold and implemented by the company. Unfortunately, the first three M&A projects I worked on, two of them were great. The last didn't work out that well. That was MCI WorldCom, which turned out to be the biggest fraud in the history of public accounting. And so shortly thereafter, the team that I was working on was disbanded, and all the attorneys and CPAs were sort of sent to the four corners of the proverbial tax universe. Some people went to Deloitte, some people went to Anderson, and I found myself back in that private practice. So, but having had that taste of sort of the corporate world, and also working with high level execs, in Fortune 50 companies, I really saw there was a need for the level of service that KPMG could provide, but not at the cost that KPMG was billing out at. So, sort of recognized early on that people really needed these services. And that while they were available to the sort of upper echelon of corporate personnel, that there's a big marketplace out there that wasn't really being served. I went to work for a smaller firm, a gentleman who was actually shared the same lesson that I did, but we actually weren't related. But everyone thought I was his son. They said, "Oh, my gosh, you're in the family practice, and you're working for Mr. Katz, and it's gonna be Katz and Katz." And so I got this sense of like nepotism with no relationship, like whatsoever. And so I had the burden of people thinking that I got the job because I was related when I wasn't related. And actually, like, the quality of work we were doing was we had some pretty interesting families that we were working with, but by and large, it was kind of a mom and pop operation. But literally, like the guy and his wife worked there, his grandchildren. I mean, they were all family members that were involved, and it just wasn't the type of practice that I wanted to be in. So in 2000, in September, I kind of went out on my own and started the JD Katz practice with a subleased office in a family law practitioner space in Bethesda, Maryland. And within a couple of weeks, I had been awarded a receivership by the circuit court. So here I am at 27, 28, knowing nothing about running construction firms. The local court here gave me a whole construction company to manage. And so the next thing I knew, I had 45 employees. I was handling payroll and infrastructure and contracting and kind of winding their way through. And these guys had massive tax liabilities, tax exposure. They were doing all sorts of terrible things. And so I was running this construction company, plus building out the estate planning and corporate side of the practice all simultaneously with no help. I had no staff. It was just me. And I was just sitting there cranking out. And within a month, I actually wound up having to hire staff because I couldn't handle all the work that I generated.
Yeah, just hearing that story makes me feel overwhelmed. Just that one project alone sounds like an 18-hour day job, actually. Well, I've looked at your website, and it looks like in the time that you've had your own firm, you've really grown it. You've got quite an impressive team there. I didn't count up the number, but just the attorneys you have relationships with, it's quite an entourage.
I'd say it's a motley crew. Yeah, I mean, we've got our full, cadre of characters in here. So we've got, estate planning, we've got tax, we've got corporate, we have litigation and real estate. And so we've really been able to build out, by bringing in sort of key personnel and practice areas over the years to really help facilitate and give full service to all of our clients.
I noticed that you have an office. Your office, I guess your primary office is in Bethesda, right? But did I see the K Street office?
Right. Yeah. So we actually have sublease space from a large law firm on K Street. So we're literally down the street from the White House, and we get calls from folks who work in government and they want to meet with us down there. And so we had actually been doing meetings down on K Street pre-pandemic, and now everybody wants to come on Zoom. Nobody actually wants to go to their office. We talk to people who are working in government offices, on K Street, and I say, oh, well, your office is only a block away from our downtown office, and they come back and say, well, that was great, pre-pandemic, but we've been working from home for the last 18 months. So Zoom is great.
Well, where I was going with that is I was going to boldly assume that because you have this K Street connection, that you have a better than average ear to the ground about what's coming down the pike in terms of tax law changes, and because my practice is, I would say, more focused on the estate planning side than business planning side. I just want to ask, what sort of intel, what's your sense about what's going to happen to the estate tax exemption come 2026 and other changes that were related?
So that's really a great question. We talk to folks, in government all the time, and so while no one has a crystal ball, the even money is that if the Democrats are in power, it's going to expire, and if the Republicans come back in, they're going to extend. And so, you have, I think, a certain hostility right now with the Congress and the current, regime that's in place, where, a lot of this is viewed as sort of the legacy of the Trump presidency, where they pushed this through. And, the current winds really don't blow in favor of, the enhanced exemption amounts. And so there is a real risk, we believe, and we're actually advising our clients now to plan as though that expiration will take place. And if it doesn't, that's great. But the IRS has already said that if you're out there making gifts now that would have been taxable gifts after January 2026, they're not going to claw back that tax savings. And so we believe that this is really the best opportunity, because no one has a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen down the road, but we do know that this is probably the best opportunity right now to go ahead and fully utilize the exemptions as they currently stand. And I would like to say, hopefully, hey, we're hopeful, we're optimistic that those exemptions will stay in place. But the reality is that, we've got a potential, change in government. We may not have the votes to get that through as far as an extension. And, the view in terms of who's paying these estate taxes are that, you're looking at a very, very small subset of the population who are, viewed as being entitled or not necessarily having earned those funds. And really, this is an opportunity for the government to soak those people. And, from the position of a politician, estate taxes are a great place to raise revenue, because the folks who are paying it aren't voting, because by definition, they're dead.
And that's even more true with the generation skipping tax, right? Because there's no payoff. I've thought there for all the noise I hear about changing that, there's no money in that for another 50 years. So what else do you see happening out there? I want to take advantage of this opportunity, because I worked in DC when I was in law school, but that was a long time ago. I just know that when you hang out, you guys talk a lot. I'm just curious to hear what else is fermenting.
I mean, I think you see a lot of trial balloons that are getting tossed out, where people are talking about, wealth tax. What does that look like? How do you start taxing people based on assets they have, not the assets that they're selling, or realizations? And so I think that's being bandied about by some of the interest groups, some of the folks on the Hill. I think, moving to that type of regime or type of implementation requires a lot of infrastructure that's not currently in place right now. You've got to have valuations. You've got to be able to go back in and, start really trying to figure out, well, where do we have funds coming in to cover these tax liabilities? I think that there's more of a focus on folks who have accumulated wealth, who then are not necessarily having realization events. And there's a thought that, hey, this is unfair when you have, the Bezoses or the Zuckerbergs of the world, who are out there with, the Amazon stock or the Facebook stock, and they don't need to sell the stock. They have so much value in the stock that, they can just borrow against it. And so for a long time, the strategies that a lot of state attorneys promoted was, buy and die, buy the office building, buy the stocks, buy whatever, run up the value, borrow against it, never have a realization event, get that step up of date of death. And then, hey, that stepped up date of death value, guess what? That thing is brought back down by all the debt you put on it. So you've never paid income tax on it, and you've never paid estate tax on that asset. And so, some of the suggestions you're seeing is, hey, why don't we cap out the amount of money that we allow to step up, or the amount of assets that we allow to step up? And that may also be gaining more popularity because of these buy and die strategies. And so, while those have been around for a long time, I think they're increasingly being viewed as abusive in the sense that, there's so much money that's not being taxed, and there's so much, value out there, and that this is potentially a good opportunity to grab those assets. One of the other problems that we've seen and that they've been trying to resolve is the enforcement. And so the IRS is an agency that has been under tremendous political scrutiny for the last 10 years. The Republicans have hated the IRS since the Tea Party, audits. They've consistently gone and cut the agency's budget again and again and again. We actually just saw recently, there was a whole article on an IRS processing center in Fresno, California, where people were manually taking apart tax returns in a lunchroom. They don't have enough space, physical space. They actually don't have computer scanners, and so they're manually key punching in all the data. And you wonder why it takes 6 to 8 months to get a refund when you send in a manual return. The agency has lost a lot of its legacy employees. They're running on computers that are older than I am. Some of them are running in ancient languages and no one has heard. So over the last year, they've gotten the opportunity to get more funding. The Biden administration pushed through more funding, and that has been kind of clawed back over the last year. Because there's a concern that they're going to add that to enforcement, and that they're going to start going after, sort of mom and pop business owners to increase the audits. The audit rate now is at an all-time low. And frankly, the agency does not have the manpower to go out and enforce the code. They don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the computer systems, and frankly, they've got a terrible reputation as a place to work. So they're having a hard time hiring. In places like the service centers, they're up there competing against Target and Starbucks for employees. And if you go to the Starbucks, you get free coffee. You go to Target, you get 20% off. You go to the IRS, you just get paper cuts. I mean, there's really not a lot to be seen.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a need for revenue. There's a need for an agency that goes ahead and enforces the law. That you're seeing a perception that there is unequal enforcement of the law. That audits in many cases are being targeted towards certain demographics or individuals. And so you're looking at an agency that's in a lot of turmoil, that has a bad rep, and that needs to get past that, to really be successful. And frankly, as practitioners, right, we need to have an agency that people respect, and that provides equal administration of the law, consistent administration of the law, and allows us to go ahead and put in appropriate levels of planning for our clients, that we're not worried that they're going to come back in and sort of lollygag in terms of enforcement, or enforce in such a manner that it targets perceived abuses from folks who are doing things like buy and die, or making lifetime gifts.
One of the targets that at the IRS level for 20 plus years has been valuation discounts on entities. Do you have a take on where that's headed?
I don't think that from an agency perspective that's changed at all. And I think that they're continuing to go in and attack lack of marketability, lack of control, accrued capital gains discounts. I think that we've seen more enforcement on the captive insurance side, where the agencies come out and issued some very aggressive position statements in terms of what they will and won't do. And they're basically saying, hey, these are now listed transactions. If you do it, you're going to get audited. It's a transaction the agency has never liked. And unfortunately, there are some good captives out there, and there's some bad captives out there, and they've just thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Said, hey, we don't want to see this for wealth transfer. We don't want to see this as being sold as a tax scheme. And they're trying to really go back in and legislate in such a way that Congress never really intended with respect to these captives.
What are you advising clients now about? Because captives can really provide a lot of real value there. What's your advice to clients these days on captives?
My first question is always, is there a need for insurance? Like, is there a need that's out there? Does the client have an esoteric risk that's not being met in the marketplace? Do they have a premium where they're paying too much? We've gone back and we've looked at these for workers' comp claims. We've looked at them for liability. And there are, many instances where, these do provide a good solution, but fundamentally, there's got to be a need, a real insurance need to go out and look at a captive. Folks are coming and saying, well, I'm looking to shelter money, or I'm looking to, limit my liability for taxes. We will highly discourage them from looking at captive. The motivation is wrong. And frankly, they don't have a justification to be in that type of product, or fully understand or comprehend what they're getting into, because it's very hard to get out of a captive once you're in. You need to run an insurance company for some period of time. And you really need to go in and operate that in a way that is business-like. And so, for those people who have the liability, or they have the risk, or let's say we have a retailer client who's out there, maybe they're selling, warranties. I mean, those are the types of things that may make sense for a captive. We had a client years ago. They were a landlord. They had hundreds and hundreds of apartment complexes, and one of their promotions that they used to do was give away a free rent month when you signed the lease. But they had all these losses. They had people who were breaking into the apartment. So we talked to them. We said, hey, instead of offering a free month of rent, why don't you offer a free year's worth of renter's insurance? It's going to cost you the same, but now you have coverage when there's losses. So they went back and they created their own captive insurance company. They started issuing these, renters policies to their tenants, but they weren't free. They were actually paying for them. They were paying money into the captive to cover the cost of the insurance. And lo and behold, when they had losses, the renter's insurance company would come in and they would go ahead and they would reimburse the client as well as the renter for those losses. And so it was a great strategy. It was a great, product for them. And it made a lot more sense for them than offering that month of free rent. So that's the type of instance where, again, this is a useful skill. It's a useful sort of add-on to them. And it really differentiated them in the marketplace because other, entities weren't offering the same type of product. They were requiring renters insurance, but then they were saying, well, you go buy it at your own cost.
Well, that's actually a clever use of captive. That's interesting. Shifting gears a bit, I feel like I'm maybe taking advantage here because, I don't get to DC and I don't get to hang around, and have dinner with lobbyists and get a sense of what's going on. So I'm sort of, I would say, taking advantage of this opportunity. But while I'm there, let me ask you about where do you come down on 453 transactions, monetized installment sale, because those have been really popular, but the IRS has gone after those as well, along with conservation easement partnerships, multi-pension trusts. Are there strategies, tax strategies out there that are just too radioactive that you tell clients stay away from them, or are there strategies that are worth the risk?
So one of the things, when I was at KPMG, we used to sell captive. We used to sell, royalty companies. We'd sell leasing companies. We did Jeffrey style IP leasing, where we would set up, if you remember Jeffrey the giraffe from Toys R Us, we would drop the IP into, one state, and then we would pay the license fees. And that was done on a state level as opposed to a federal level to minimize state income taxes as opposed to federal. That transaction got moved offshore, 15, 20 years ago, and now it's sitting in Luxembourg or, the Grenadines. And so US companies are using that to limit their, payments on US corporate taxes as opposed to state income tax. And so those are the types of things where, offshore transactions are ones that we are not necessarily big fans of because we think they're getting increased scrutiny. Transfer pricing, where, you don't have arm's length pricing between the parent company and the subsidiary. I think the famous case was Bosch and Lomb, where the contact lenses were all being run through an Irish subsidiary, and then they were picking up 95% of the profits and 5% was being picked up in the United States. So those are the kinds of things where, you're going to wind up with potentially a reallocation. And frankly, we always look at what we call the smell test. If it doesn't smell right, it probably isn't. So we would rather our clients come in and say, well, we're going to try to do some paper cuts here as far as, tax blending, as opposed to trying to bleed out an artery. And so we do two things. One is we can justify the planning. The planning is implemented as part of the overall business process as opposed to tax planning. So selling tax planning for the purpose of reducing taxes is not a great way, but having a business purpose that is not, the prime purpose is not to reduce tax, goes a long way towards mollifying auditors and agents and going back in and trying to understand. One of the challenges we see is that a lot of these agents don't have the level of experience. They haven't been at this long enough, and they sort of go back and they view, every problem is a nail, and then they think of themselves as the hammer. They're there to bang away at it. And so, part of our job is just educating the auditors who are going through these transactions and giving them, perspective as to what's happening and why these transactions are taking place, that they view them with the independent significance. Again, like we always just talk about playing audit roulette when I was at KPMG. We used to say we don't play audit roulette, because the question here isn't what happens if you get audited. The question is what happens when you get audited. How will you show up in that audit? Will this transaction, survive, or will it not survive? And so the better prepared, the client can be, the more they've gone through and thought about the process and said, well, how does this integrate with my business? And is this something that's being sold solely for tax purposes, or is this something that has a real business purpose? The better they're going to do in the outcome. And so tax attorneys really can't work in a silo. They have to be involved with the business folks. They need to be involved with the accountants up front. And they need to be asking the right questions and integrating that on a granular basis, right? So even if, there may have been a tax motivation at some point, but there's also a business purpose, right, for that transaction.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. Let me ask you, you've been at this for a while. What would you say is the distinction of how you approach a client relationship? What is it that you think is distinctive about the way you do this?
I think clients fundamentally know that we care. So the thing is, I didn't go to law school because I wanted to be a lawyer. I was a business guy who wanted a law degree. And so when we come in, we work with a business client or a personal family client. We're there saying, hey, we view this as a business transaction first and foremost, and we understand what your goals and objectives are. So it's not the tax tail wagging the dog. It's really, getting the client, understanding their motivations, understanding their values, understanding their mission, trying to understand their mindset in terms of what's getting them from point A to point B, what's motivating them, what are their fears, what are their concerns, and being able to take all that and put that into whatever the advice is. And so, we're looking at it not just at a very superficial level, but we're really trying to deep dive with that client as early as possible. And the irony is that, I've been doing this for, 23 years now. I still have clients who call me from the first year of my practice who are coming back for more work. And we've had, same clients who come back again and again and again for new transactions. And over the last 20 years, we've grown the practice out. We literally have tens of thousands of clients right now. But there's no client who's too small for me to talk to. I can have a client with $1,000 worth of legal work, and they want to get on the phone with me. I pick up the phone and I'm happy to chat with them and help them through the process. And then during that call, so I'll let them know what my rate is. I'll say, well, are you sure you really want to talk to me? Because I'm happy to talk to you, but when the bill comes, I don't want you to have sticker shock. We've got some really great attorneys here who can do, maybe not as good a job, but almost as good a job as I can do it at half the cost. And I'll review it anyway before it goes out. I may not even charge you to look at it. Are you sure you want to talk? Some clients say, yeah, I do. And some clients say, well, I appreciate, you're picking up the phone at Jeff, and why don't you hand it over to the associate at this point? So we're happy to do that as well.
Jeffrey, you may be too young to have even thought about this yet, but if you fast forward another 20 or 25 or 30 years, and you're really reflecting back on your professional practice over your entire career, what is it that you would like your legacy to be?
And that's a great question. And so I often ask people that, if you were to put three words on your tombstone, what would it be? And I always say, father, husband, and friend. And so I think, if you really get into, helping people along, and you're there not for the transaction, you're there for the journey, I really do think that people appreciate that. And it's so hard. There's so many transactions that we get into where people come in on a transactional basis, knowing that you've got the attorney who's there, who's going to be there for you. And even if I'm not the guy that's there, that, my values and my legacy have been imbued through the practice, and that the folks that we've hired come in and support that same legacy, it's really meaningful to me. And knowing that we've made that impact, not only on the clients, but also on people who work for us and their families.
Good answer. And I think that's a great legacy, actually. So what else, what questions have I not asked? What are the things that do our listeners need to hear from you?
Yeah. So, over the last probably 20 years, we've really changed our business. And I think, attorneys have, as a profession, attorneys have an obligation to continue to evolve as the law evolves. And so we've done that both personally and for our practice. We've really embraced technology here to make ourselves more accessible. Over the last couple of years, Zoom has really become our default standard for intakes. And so one of the things we found is we've been able to substantially increase the number of intakes we're taking on. I think this year we may do something between 550 and 600 estate plans. And so, that's a huge volume. And so we've had to adapt not only to the fact that we're doing this increased volume, but also in terms of our production. So how are we producing documents? Are we doing them in a consistent manner? How are we delivering, that A experience? Or if you think about Disney World, the old Space Mountain or Pirates of the Caribbean, those are called e-ticket attractions. So we try to give our clients an e-ticket experience here, by exceeding expectations, by, embracing technology, by making ourselves accessible. So some things we've done is we have online calendaring. Clients can go in, they can pick a time, set themselves up. When they do that, they'll obviously get a questionnaire for their intake, and they'll get a series of reminders. And so we not only do we call people with a computer system that calls people, it also texts them, it emails them. And so we used to have a 25% no-show rate. Clients would forget about their appointments. They would, they weren't prepared. And our 25% no-show rate went down to 0%. We actually only had one client last year who didn't attend their consult. The reason they hadn't attended is because they were in the hospital that day. They had their actual consult. So they had gotten ill and weren't able to make it. So, we're trying to leverage technology to really make ourselves accessible. We're using, AI systems now to help with legal research. We're using that to go back in and again, accelerate sort of what we're doing. And I think that's making us more efficient. It gives us better output, better products. And so, we're trying to make use of what we can in the way of technology to really, enhance that client experience and deliver that, ticket experience every client, every time.
That's you're an inspiration. I'm actually here taking mental notes. And so some of these things, I'm going to have a team meeting with my own team about it, and I'm going to have them watch this video. So I really appreciate the time today. This has actually been I'm going to say for me, this has been really, really useful, really, really, really useful. And I would say to our listeners, if you want to know more about Jeffrey and his firm, you can go to his website, which is, by the way, a great website. I spent some time on it. You guys have done a really terrific job with that. I think it's clear, informative. There's some great resources there. It's jdkatz.com. Did I get that right?
Yep. J is in Juliet, D is in Delta, K is in Kilo, A is in Alpha, T is in Tango, Z is in Zulu. Jeffrey, jdkatz.com. It's my military alphabet for you.
Yeah. Well, great. So let me just say to our audience, thank you for listening. This has been the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Stan Miller. Our guest today was Jeffrey Katz. For more information, you can go to his website, jdkatz.com, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. So thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Stan. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.